Chalk one up for old school football. Mark Rogers TV just a few minutes after Stanford held off Oregon 26-20. The Ducks put on a flurry at the finish to get it close and make a lot of people in Tallahassee and Columbus very nervous. But make no mistake about it, the Cardinal dominated this football game for the first 55 minutes in holding a 26-0 lead. And yes, the Ducks got their shot in the last 5 minutes, and if they could have recovered one more onside kick, it could have gotten very interesting. But Stanford proved to be the better football team on this day. Huge BCS implications on this night with, of course, this game and Baylor taking care of business at home against Oklahoma. We'll get to that in just a second, but let's talk about this particular football game, because this was a Stanford type of football game, and they made it that way. They imposed their type of approach, their will on Oregon. They were the much better football team because they were the much more physical football team. Let's start with the offensive line. The broadcast spotlighted the senior guard, David Yankee from Georgia, a number of times, but it was across the board, the Stanford offensive line, and it's funny to watch the lack of splits along the offensive line. They crowd together, and this is not just a short yardage type of scheme and split formation for the Stanford Cardinal. They did this the bulk of the time. This was obviously the way they wanted to play this football game, even more so than they have the past few years when they've thrown it 22 times. Kevin Hogan threw the football 13 times in this football game. They came out and said, number one, we want to keep the ball away from Marcus Mariota. Number two, we believe we are tougher. We've got a stronger will. We can plod and gain 3 and gain 5 and gain 4 and gain 1 and just beat on this football team and impose our will. And that's exactly what Stanford did. Again, 270 yards rushing by the Stanford Cardinal team, and most of it was between the tackles. How many times did they run it on 3rd and 3, 4th and 1, continue to go at 4th and 1, and they never went play action pass. They never went with any kind of trickery. And contrast that to the Oklahoma game. They went for it a number of times on 3rd and 4th and short and tried to have their quarterback run wide and gain yardage and convert first downs, and that didn't work. The Stanford game plan was to trust the offensive line and Tyler Gaffney getting the football a school record 45 times for 157 yards. So that tells you right there that the ground game was extremely effective, but he was not breaking off for big gainers. 45 carries for $145, just about 3.5 yards per carry for Gaffney. But again, very effective. Credit Kevin Hogan, holding on to the football, not making the big mistake, doing the things that he needed to do. Especially early in the football game, he was very sharp. The one big mistake he made did not cost him due to a pass interference call down near the goal line. He threw a horrible pass going for the bomb on about the 3rd or 4th possession of the football game. But again, the pass interference gave the ball back to Stanford. They scored the touchdown to put this game in a comfortable position for them. But Hogan is 7 of 13, and he ran very effectively. I thought a key to this game, a key play early on with a 14-0 lead, but Oregon looking to trap Stanford deep, forced them to punt. On like a 3rd and 6 play, Hogan got away from 3 defenders, and just again, it was another case of a Stanford football player being tougher, being more determined than Oregon. I don't know if Oregon looked at the 10.5 point spread. I don't know if they just thought, that was a mirage last season at Austin Stadium. That can't happen again. Mariota's better. We're better. We're going to break loose. We're going to make things happen. We're going to play Oregon football. And yes, this is a tough football team we're playing, but we're so much more talented and athletic and fast. We'll break some big plays, and we got to win this football game. They looked lackadaisical all around. Oregon did. I'm not going to question effort because they made the tackles in space. They ran to the football on defense, but they just got beat up front. And this was an Oregon defensive line that, unlike previous defensive lines, has certainly more bulk and more size and more mass than it has to take on these type of football games. And in particular, because of Stanford's challenge in recent seasons, these guys have been recruited specifically to take on the Stanford Cardinal running game, but they were not good enough to do that. Again, Not huge runs, not huge big gains on offense in the running game for Stanford, but they just pounded away. 45 for 157 for Tyler Gaffney. And again, 270 rushing yards for that Stanford offense. And credit Kevin Hogan. He was a game manager deluxe tonight, 7 of 13, but picking up key third down conversions with his feet. Flip the side, and you see where the Oregon offense could never get untracked. The Stanford defense was so impressive, but they got their rest because of the Stanford offense running the football 60 plus times and maintaining time of possession at 42 and a half minutes to Oregon's 17 and a half. So guys like this senior group for Stanford's got to be very proud of this effort and their entire careers there at Stanford in losing just a handful of football games. Shane Scove was exceptional, senior linebacker. A.J. Tarpley, Ben Gardner, who has been playing out of his mind in recent weeks, had season-ending surgery, so they kind of dedicated this game to Ben Gardner. That proved not to be a huge loss. I thought it was going to be a big loss for this football team because I saw much of the Oregon State game where Stanford held on in the final seconds near the goal line in preserving a 20-12 win, and Gardner was huge in that game, but they didn't miss him. They got Henry Anderson back, the other defensive end, Trent Murphy, and in the defensive secondary, Alex Carter came up from his defensive back position a number of times to make big plays near the line of scrimmage. Oregon came into this game rushing the football for the second most yardage in the country, and they were held to 61 yards. Now, of course, that includes in college football sack yardage as well, but 24 attempts for 61 yards. And to hold Byron Marshall and DeAnthony Thomas in check. Thomas ran it 8 times for 30 yards, basically not a whole lot there. Byron Marshall did have a 21-yard run, but other than that, he was completely bottled up. So there was the 21-yard run and no other double-digit runs for the Oregon Ducks against this Stanford front seven. Okay, then you've got, we certainly want to mention that Thomas Tyner, who has been running the football as much as anybody on that Stanford or on the Oregon offense, only got 1 carry tonight in the football game. So, again, Stanford defeats Oregon. The Cardinal with a 1 loss to Utah on the road. That's on their resume, but it's very impressive otherwise. So, this is how we see the BCS right now. Alabama continues to be number 1. This obviously moves Florida State into the 2 position. The Seminoles have a date with Florida to close the season. That doesn't look to be the challenge that it typically is, with the Gators really hurting and inept on offense than an ACC championship game against Miami, most notably. All right, for the Alabama Crimson Tide, let's jump back to the 1 position because the Tide, of course, has a challenge coming up against LSU on Saturday night. They also play the Iron Bowl against the rejuvenated and revamped Auburn Tigers of Gus Malzahn, and then the SEC championship game, if they make it that far, against most probably would be Missouri, but possibly South Carolina. Ohio State sitting in the 3 position. Their schedule has been the huge knock against the Buckeyes and barely getting past Northwestern and Iowa in particular. And Baylor came up huge tonight in winning against Oklahoma 41-12. For most football fans and pundits out there, that Baylor Bears victory is going to look mighty impressive against a top 10 Oklahoma team because the Bears had played absolutely nobody. We're talking about Kansas State at 4-4, by far being their best competition to date before playing the Sooners on this night and completely dominating the football game 41-12. It took them a while to get rolling on offense, but the defense dominated Blake Bell and the backup quarterback Knight and the Oklahoma offense the entire night. The Baylor Bears were impressive, more so on defense than offense, because Petty at quarterback was all over the place, especially early in the game trying to throw the football. I don't know if he was nervous coming out, but he was very inaccurate. So the way I see it is Alabama 1, Florida State 2, Ohio State 3, Baylor 4. The reason I believe that the Buckeyes should hold off the Bears for the 3 position is that, again, despite the poor schedule that Ohio State plays, Oklahoma is not a top 10 football team. This team lost to Texas, and the Longhorns, of course, had their issues with Ole Miss getting blown out by the Rebels and BYU. I don't believe that Oklahoma's a top 10 team or anything close to a top 10 team. I certainly think Wisconsin's a better football team on Ohio State's schedule than for Oklahoma. The key for the Buckeyes, in addition to getting a loss out of Alabama or Florida State, and it wouldn't hurt if the Baylor Bears got knocked out as well, would be for Michigan to run the table and finish with just 2 losses before playing Ohio State. And more so for the Buckeyes would be Michigan State, who's finally breaking into the polls and getting some respect in the top 25, for the Spartans to run the table and arrive at the Big Ten championship game with an 11-1 record. For Baylor, they certainly have opportunities to play better, more quality opponents. Not great opponents, but decent opponents, top 25, top 30 opponents, talking about Oklahoma State most notably, also Texas and Texas Tech. Then you've got to consider Stanford, but they lost a football game, and it was not against a good football team. It was against a Utah Utes team that is now 1-4 in the Pac-12. We have no idea what happened to Stanford on that night, but Utah physically beat up Stanford on that night. This team that dominated Oregon and dominates teams physically up and down the schedule lost because of a physically dominating performance by the Utes on the road. But if you look at the resume of Stanford top to bottom, it's very impressive now with wins over Oregon, Oregon State, Washington. They defeated UCLA as well. They will have to go and beat Notre Dame. They've got a date in the Pac-12 championship game as well. So Stanford, in getting in position for a national championship game, would have a couple more wins to boost those BCS points as well. Would love to hear from you on your take on tonight's Oregon-Stanford game. Also toss in comments on Baylor blasting Oklahoma 41-12 and this BCS mess, because it is truly a mess. And for all the times that I hear that people say that it works itself out, it does not. It never has. It never will. And finally, this is the last year of it. All right. Would love to hear from you now on all these teams fighting for BCS recognition and the national championship game right here on Mark Rogers TV.